Welcome aboard.
Great. Thank you for all you do.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the joint informational hearing of the Assembly Education Committee, the Assembly Higher Education Committee, and certainly the Senate Education Committee. Thank you for your attendance today and your interest in adult education. The purpose of this hearing is to hear from the Department of Education and the California Community College's Chancellor's Office on the final AB 86 report. The hearing will also give our members an opportunity to hear from the Department of Finance on the Governor's proposal to allocate $500 million for the adult education block grant. And I'm going to have some of the other chairs speak, but just from my perspective, I left the classroom in mid-December, actually got sworn in and went back. Spent over 20 years teaching, but some of those years at night I taught adult education. I taught ESL in Garden Grove to mainly Vietnamese and Korean population, and then in Paramount, where I come from, for a number of years as well. So I'm familiar with adult education, teaching it, but also in the classroom. I know that we used it as credit recovery for some of our high school students. So certainly a necessary venture, and I always say that the adult education teachers make America work, because they teach language skills, they teach parenting skills, they teach citizenship skills, and a variety of other employment skills. So it's a very important element of our education program. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Senator Liu for some introductory remarks.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to join everyone here, and just to remind you that a long time ago, I was chair of the Assembly Higher Education Committee, and where we learned 10 years ago, still holds true today, improvement in literacy and job readiness by our adult population and California's economic future are inextricably linked together. And the needs are great and growing, and we're not meeting them. We have nearly 4 million people, adults, remaining in our communities unserved. So over the last 2 years, there's been significant dialogue around redesigning and reinvesting the delivery of services for adult education. The regional consortia, collaborations, and partnerships like AB 86 across systems are steps toward utilizing state resources more efficiently. Change takes time, but this is a very exciting time for education reform, and I'm sure all of those of you who are involved in that reform are probably tired of the word reform. But I look forward to hearing the update, as well as recommendations on how we can address the needs of our adult learners in this state and its changing landscape. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair Liu. And I always say a good teacher reforms education in their classroom every day.
Every day.
And if we could also, I just want to note the presence of our budget chair, Assemblymember Weber, right there. We have Young Kim, an Assembly member, Assemblymember Lowe, and Assemblymember Baker have entered the room. And if Chair Medina of Higher Education, if he wanted to offer some introductory comments.
Thank you, Chair O'Donnell, and good afternoon. I'm pleased to be here this afternoon to join the Assembly and Senate Education Committees to discuss adult education. And like my colleague, Mr. O'Donnell, I also was a classroom teacher where I taught not only high school and elementary school, but also adult ed, where I was a ESL teacher in Riverside. ESL teacher to mostly a Spanish-speaking community, teaching adult ed after my day of teaching high school. And I also was a school board member, K-12 school board member, and following that I was a community college trustee and a teacher in community college. So I know that as we're moving forward with adult education in the state of California, we're bringing these different groups together. We're bringing the K-12 community with the community college community, and perhaps two communities who have not had a long history of talking to each other. And I know that as a trustee, as a faculty member, and as a K-12 teacher. But I'm very happy to be here to hear from a panel of experts regarding how we move forward with adult education, and look forward to hearing from the panels and finding out their recommendations, hearing the recommendations of AB 86, as well as the perspectives of the different regional consortiums and that very K-12 and community college districts that I spoke about. Also hearing from the Department of Finance and the Legislative Analyst's Office of the Governor's Adult Education Budget Proposal. So very much looking forward to this hearing.
Thank you, Chair Medina. And if I could just add, for the audience and those listening, there are links to all the background material that we're discussing today on all three committee websites. So the links, again, are on all three committee websites. And with that, if we could bring forward our first speaker, which will give us an overview of K-12 and California Community College's adult education programs. We'll have Ms. Natasha Collins come forward. She's the Fiscal and Policy Analyst with the Legislative Analyst's Office.
And Judy Hyman, too.
Judy Hyman?
Yeah, she's coming over there.
Judy Hyman will join her as well.
And Senator Vance.
And Senator Pan, welcome.
Good afternoon. Natasha Collins with the Legislative Analyst's Office, and I'm joined by my colleague Judy Hyman. The sergeant is distributing a handout. We were asked to provide a brief overview and history of adult education in the state of California. We begin doing that on page 1 of your handout, where we give some information about the historical objectives of adult education in the state. The primary purpose of adult education is to provide adults with the pre-collegiate knowledge they need to be fully engaged in civic life and join the workforce, and more generally. The most common instructional areas for adult education are within basic skills in math and English, English as a second language and citizenship, and career technical education or vocational education. While these are the core areas in which adult education is provided, there are other provisions as well, such as through parenting classes or enrichment classes for older adults. Various populations access adult education services. For example, recent immigrants who wish to learn English, perhaps a semi-literate adult who wishes to help their student in school with their homework, maybe a mid-career professional who wishes to gain some more skills to move up in her field, or even a high school dropout who wishes to gain their high school diploma or its equivalent so they can go on to higher education or employment. As shown in page 2, the state of California has offered its citizens adult education for over 150 years. The first adult schools were administered through school districts. Henceforth, we'll refer to adult education offered by school districts as adult schools. Community colleges later began offering adult education in the 1940s. Over time, throughout certain areas of the state, both providers offered adult education, though often with little coordination between the two segments. Part of that is because the state was unclear about whose core responsibility it was to provide adult education. The state authorized both segments, but was not explicit in who it expected to provide adult education. Other entities have also offered adult education, but largely on a smaller scale. So, for example, county offices of education offer adult education to inmates at correctional county facilities, for example, or other various state agencies might offer adult education. However, adult schools and community colleges remain the state's largest providers, and we estimate that they served 1.5 million adults in 2010. Adult education is funded through 3 primary sources. First, through state funds, next through federal funds, and finally through student fees. State funding for adult schools was traditionally through a categorical program. This was funding that the state provided to school districts in order to offer students in its area adult education. However, in 2009, due to the budget crisis, funds for adult education went into a flexibility provision, meaning that in order to cope with budget woes, school districts are able to use adult education funding towards any educational purpose. We estimate that during this time of flexibility, between 2009 and 2013, school districts used only half of the allotment beforehand towards adult education, cutting it from $635 million to between $300 and $350 million. In contrast, the state funds community college adult education through apportionments, which is the way that community colleges are funded more generally. It's the funding enrollment that is provided to all community college students. The California community colleges estimate that they spent about $1.2 billion on adult education last year. Federal funding for adult education is the next largest source. The California Department of Education administers the Federal Workforce Investment Act dollars through Title II, which generally provides basic literacy programs to students at community colleges, adult schools, or through other providers such as libraries or community-based organizations. In 2014-15, the CDE administered $86 million towards these purposes. Lastly, adult schools and community colleges may charge fees in order to generate revenue for their adult education programs. Student fees vary by provider and by program type. At community colleges, they do not charge a fee for non-credit adult education courses, but the state has allowed them to charge $46 per unit for community college credit courses. At adult schools, fees range broadly. So, for example, an adult school could charge nothing to its students for instruction, all the way to the full cost of instruction. An example might be a school that we identified that charges over $1,000, which would be the full cost of instruction for a dental assistance program. We estimate that fee revenue through community colleges and adult schools was in the low tens of millions of dollars for school districts recently and over $100 million for community colleges. We just provided a history of funding and providers, and now we're going to take you to more current history from 2013-14 forward and what's been happening recently in adult education. In our 2012 report, the LAO's 2012 report, Restructuring California's Adult Education System, which you can find in your binder, our office pointed to the need for a systematic reform of the adult education system in the state. Subsequently, the state charted a new course for adult education in the budget trailer bill of that year, known as AB 86. AB 86 had several provisions that recharted the way that we approach adult education in the state. First, it narrowed the scope of adult education to 5 areas of instruction, which you'll find listed on page 5 of your handout. These areas include basic skills in math and English, citizenship and English as a second language, and career technical education. Second, AB 86 eliminated the adult education categorical program for school districts and rolled the associated funding into the local control funding formula. However, to ensure that adult schools continue to provide education to adults, there was a maintenance of effort provision put in. So school districts were required to spend for 2 years whatever they spent on adult education in the 2012-2013 school year. That maintenance of effort provision will be expiring this year, 2015, in June. Next, AB 86 provided $25 million in planning grants for adult education providers to form regional consortia to better meet the needs and coordinate across segments. Participants in these consortia could also include other providers, such as libraries, community-based organizations, and other state agencies that offered adult education. AB 86 lastly included reporting requirements, something that you'll hear about in your next panel. There was a report released on the progress of AB 86 in March 2014, and a report was released just last week on how the implementation of this new vision is working so far. Also, AB 86 had an intent to fund for 2015-16 to provide additional funds to adults' education moving forward. On page 7, we address 2014 legislation that spoke to other remaining issues pertaining to adult education. Senator Liu authored Senate Bill 173, which tasked the Chancellor's Office and the Department of Education with submitting recommendations pertaining to more consistent policies across adult education providers. For example, in the development of a common assessment for adults that were entering adult education and how they would be placed in different programs. Second, to develop a consistent fee policy across segments. And third, to develop a comprehensive accountability system that all adult education providers could submit data to, and the state could hold them accountable for student results. SB 173 also tasked the Commission on Teacher Credentialing and the Academic Senate at the community colleges to make recommendations pertaining to instruction at adult schools, making it more consistent across segments in terms of credentialing. Although not specifically pertaining to AB 86, there was another important piece of legislation in 2014 authored by Assemblymember Mullen, which was AB 2148. This bill required the California Workforce Investment Board to develop a workforce metrics dashboard, which all workforce education and training providers could submit outcome data to, so the state could more easily see what it was getting for its workforce investment. This summary of what's happened up to this point concludes our presentation, but your next panel will be discussing the implementation of the AB 86 Consortia program. However, for your reference, you'll notice that the next few pages include an implementation update and our assessment of how the process has been going so far. Keep this handout, though, because we'll be back on your third panel to comment on the governor's proposal, which you'll find later in this handout. With that, we'd be happy to take any questions, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Collins. I have a question. How many K-12 adult ed programs have been closed due to the budget crisis? Do we have numbers?
Yes, we do.
On how many have collapsed? How many have gone away? Specific
It
to
was
the,
600
specific to the enrollment, well, if you have that.
Sure. The preliminary reports show that the number of adult schools fell from about 620 before the recession in 2008-9 to 554, which is a drop of about 11%. And enrollment in adult education, and this was at the adult schools, that drop. In terms of enrollment drops in adult schools, so the K-12 or the school district programs, the drop was 36% of enrollment, and at community colleges it was 18% of enrollment. So I think what we saw was enrollment was not dropping as much as funding. People were getting leaner with their programs or cutting ends where they could. Okay.
And if I could just, this is a big picture question. The whole effort of AB 86, amongst other things, was to get the adult ed programs to comport with some of the workforce investment dollars. Is that correct? And efforts?
Yes. One of the goals was to better coordinate across regions the types of services that were being provided to folks that were trying to engage more in the workforce.
And could you just spend a minute elaborating on the consortia process so people in this room behind this dais understand quickly, what that process was, what the consortia process was, and what the end result was?
Sure. I think that your next panel will probably be able to speak to that in more detail.
That's fine.
But generally, the school districts and community colleges came together in the past 2 years to meet periodically in order to take a tally of the resources that they had, the students they were serving, and how to better align those. Typically, it was those that were already offering adult education. So you had school districts that had been offering it through the recession joining these consortia. All community college districts joined consortia. But also you had some school districts and other providers that had not offered it previous and were interested maybe in getting back in the adult education landscape, or just being involved more generally. They saw a need in their communities.
And there were 70 across the states, 70 planning bodies, if you will, that ultimately came forward with a report on March 1st, am I correct?
That's correct. The 70 bodies are based on the community college district boundaries, and 2 of them collapsed to form 70 from 72.
Great. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Medina. Yeah, does anybody else have any questions? I'm sorry.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes,
Just a quick one. Both a comment and a question. In my district, just this last week, a 70-year-old adult education program that's been very successful and served several communities in my district, and over about 2,000 students annually, was closed and effectively cut. Some of the programs they offered were workforce and how to get JED and GED and other programs, and other classes were enrichment. Do you have a sense from the analysis you've done of how much more enrichment classes and enrichment opportunities have been cut, and how much the cuts or greatest challenges have been to workforce and getting people up to skills?
The plans did not speak as much to the enrichment courses because AB 86 focused on 5 primary areas, and many of the enrichment courses were not in those 5 areas. There's not as much information on how those were treated, but the AB 86 report does include information on those 5 areas.
Any further questions?
I have a question.
Mr. Medina.
Ms. Collins, we're going to hear about the efforts of AB 86 moving forward. But looking back, would you be willing to say where you think the state went wrong in adult education? Looking back, what were some of the problems with adult education?
Hi, Judy Hyman with Legislative Analyst's Office. I think our 2012 report outlined a real lack of coordination across the segments, and as Ms. Collins mentioned, part of that was related to some lack of clarity in state law, tasking both the community colleges and school districts with providing adult education, but not making it the primary responsibility of either segment. So it really left it to local areas to figure it out for themselves how they were going to divvy it up to a large extent, and there wasn't real required coordination.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Medina.
Well, thank you, Ms. Collins, for your review on adult education. At this time, I would like to invite up Dr. Deborah Jones, Dean of Career Education Practices from the California Community Colleges Chancellor's Office, and Russ Weichel, Director of Career and College Transition Division from the California Department of Education, as well as Alejandro Espinosa. And this panel will cover the final AB 86 report, its recommendations, and moving forward. And Dr. Jones, if you'd care to begin.
Good afternoon, chairs and members of the committees. We've provided a handout, and in this handout on page 2 and 3, you'll see some of the demographic information about the enrollments and the decline of adult education over the past 5 years. And with that, I'd like to turn this over to Russ Weichel, and then we'll be going back and forth through our presentation.
Good afternoon, Assembly members Medina, O'Donnell, Senator Liu, and members of the Assembly Higher Ed Committee and Senate Education Committee. I'm Russ Weichel, the Director of Career and College Transition Division at the California Department of Education. I'm here today with my colleague, Deborah Jones, Dean of Career Education Practices at the California Community College Chancellor's Office, to provide an overview of a 2-year planning process and present the findings of the final AB 86 report. I'd like to begin by acknowledging all the hard work the consortia have done over the last 2 years. This process brought together 2 different state systems delivering adult education, but more importantly, throughout this effort, local providers have come together to communicate and collaborate. There have been many challenges along the way, but districts and community colleges, along with other partners, worked together with the goal of coordinating adult education on a regional level and accomplished a lot in this short period of time. While much has been achieved, there is more work still ahead, both at the state level and at the local level. I'll begin with a short overview of AB 86 and SB 173. AB 86 charged the California Community College Chancellor's Office and the California Department of Ed to jointly implement a planning process to integrate and improve adult education. AB 86 appropriated $25 million administered through the Chancellor's Office for the development of regional consortia composed of at least one community college, one K-12 district, as well as other partners to assess their regions and develop shared plans. AB 86 also required the Chancellor's Office and the California Department of Education to submit a joint report and provide recommendations. As directed by AB 86, this report details the needs that emerged from the 70 consortia reports and the joint recommendations from both the Chancellor's Office and the California Department of Education. Senate Bill 173 also required the report to address the following in the provision of adult education through K-12 adult and community college systems: accountability, assessment, evaluation, and data collection and fees. I'll now turn over to Deborah Jones, who will go over the process both agencies took to make these recommendations in AB 86.
Thank you. So we began the process about a year and a half ago and put together a work group and a cabinet. The cabinet was made up of 4 members from each of the agencies, from CDE and from the Chancellor's Office. The work group was made up of 12, the original work group was made up of 12 members. Those included field people from the K-12 partnership, field people from the Chancellor's Office, staff from the Chancellor's Office, and from the K-12 partners, as from the California Department of Education as well. And we worked together to put out an RFA. We created the RFA, we put it out. We took the legislation, AB 86, literally, to define the geographic boundaries of the consortia. And that's how we came up with the 72 consortia. Now, there were 2 areas in California who had crossed those geographic boundaries and historically had been working together. They merged and became a larger consortia. A planning formula was created with the help of demographers and ethnographers and experts, economists, that put out money to each of these consortia based upon planning dollars and need, and those needs were identified based upon those 5 areas. So employment or unemployment need, and employment for basic skills and ESL languages other than English, the first language spoken at home. Adults with disability was matched to a need of adults in that area receiving SDI. So those needs were matched, dollars were put forward, and each consortia received a different amount of money to run their planning process through the year and a half. We began meeting weekly. We hired, in the interim, we hired consultants to help us with this. McKinsey came on board. We expanded the work group to include about 40 members of the different advocacy groups, both on the K-12 and the community college side, to include students, to include faculty. We operated under 3 different principles: inclusion, transparency, equity, and above all, the representation of adult learners in California. We were doing this for the students in California. I have worked, I started out as a teacher in adult education. I was the state director at the California Department of Education for almost 5 years, and I moved over to the community colleges. So I have a perspective from both sides. And understand that this is difficult work, that these 2 entities had not collaborated, and you talked a little bit about that earlier. We would come from the California Department of Education. I would bring staff to the community colleges, and we would talk about what each one of us did. But that never filtered down to the locals, and it's only been in the year and a half that these conversations and dialogues have begun. In the report, I want to talk a little bit about the challenges that were identified by these consortia who have worked so diligently. They were asked to identify needs, us to identify the gaps, to look at the landscape of the current providers, not just the K-12 and community college providers, but those community partners, the Workforce Investment Board partners, the libraries, the tutors, the community-based organizations. And they identified the challenges. The challenges are in your report, and I'm just going to go over them. There's an insufficient availability of adult education programs. This was about the cuts and the closures since 2008. There was a lack of alignment identified, and we talked a little bit about that, the coordination between the two systems. And there were just fewer teachers, fewer faculty, fewer classes. The need is greater. There's also a need for innovation in adult education programming, a need for transparent pathways and a clear pipeline so students could go from the K-12 provider system into the community college system seamlessly. There's a need to strengthen curricula, dual enrollment, bridge programs, modularization, the expansion of contextualized classes. They also identified a need to offer online or hybrid classes. And this is to meet the needs of adult learners whose schedules are different, people who are working one job or two jobs, or who are home taking care of families. They want flexible scheduling, work-based learning opportunities, and flexible locations where they can have their adult education programs. There's a focus or a lack of. They identified a need for anchor skills, reasoning and critical thinking, and they identified a need for 21st job skills in their students, and these are especially in the area of technology. They said that they needed to deepen the links and the partnerships to vocation and career, that there was a lack of those community partnerships. Oftentimes academia and the teaching of the educational piece was separate from the workforce piece. This was a need that was identified by our consortia. And there were new demands on faculty and instructors that were going to require professional development. Inadequate social, academic, and financial supports was a need that was identified. There was a lack of tutoring or individual learning plans, a lack of cohort-based instruction, and these evidence-based best practices that accelerate a student's growth. There was a need for social services, transportation, childcare, and increased needs for underrepresented populations. And those populations, parolees, veterans, may have increased needs, students with disabilities. They identified a lack of counselors and guidance technicians and a lack of consistent fees, which was talked about a little bit by the LAO. There was inconsistency across the K-12 and community college districts regarding assessments for placement. The WIA providers use CASAS. There are multiple measures of assessments used by the community colleges, and they don't align. There hasn't been discussion about the alignment. There's a lack of work readiness assessment in all of these assessments. There was a lack of a common accountability approach for evaluating student progress and program outcomes. There wasn't a unified approach. Each system has an approach to accountability. Each system has an adequate approach to accountability, and yet there isn't a system that reads these. There aren't common measures, aren't common performance indicators or outcome measures. Inconsistent student identifiers was identified by the consortia and is in the report. Limited regional coordination, insufficient K-12 and community college coordination, a malalignment of pathways, and this could be course programs of study pathways that are specific to specific courses, but also that pipeline of students moving effortlessly or seamlessly through programs, and then insufficient integration of community partners. I talked a little bit about that. So this was a framework for the recommendations. And you can begin with the recommendations, Russ.